It's our second getting to know the Fight Game Media podcasters, and by the time you listen to this, or by the time you watch this, the first one with Scott Edwards, aka Scott E Wrestling, is already on the Patreon, but it will also be on our public YouTube channel. So you can go check that out if you want to see Scott and hear about his story and how he got into doing what he's been doing. But now, number two, we're bringing in Mike Gilbert. What's going on?
Hey now, how's it going, Gigi? Thanks for letting me do this.
So I think people will know you from two podcasts that you've done on this network, but you've been attempting to podcast sort of like me for quite a while, and have had some other projects here and there. I know you and your cousin did one back in the day. So what do you enjoy about the audio medium, and like who were like the influences for you to decide that you wanted to do stuff like this?
Well, as you well know, my biggest influence on me was Howard Stern, and like I grew up listening to Howard. I would wake up early before school. We got the New Rock 104 in Fresno used to air Stern every single morning, so I would actually wake up and I would listen to it early. Like a lot of kids are waking up at the last minute to go to school. Not me. I was waking up a couple hours early because I had to hear some Stern. And so I just always loved the way that they did that show, not just like the vulgarity and all that stuff, but like it was just like a big kind of like a like hanging out with your boys.
Mm-hmm.
Like I just loved that atmosphere of it and all the different ancillary characters that they had on it, and you could kind of just say anything and kind of bust each other's chops. And so that always appealed to me. So from an early age, I was a big fan of Stern. I also liked Adam Carolla and Dr. Drew on Loveline. I would listen to them at night. And then I would listen to this guy called the Shadow Man on the Squared Circle on Cable Radio Network. He did a show on Friday nights, and that was my first entry into listening to pro wrestling radio. So it was like those three guys. And when I was in high school, whenever we had career day, I said that I wanted to be on the radio. Actually, even going back, even like in 8th grade when we did career day, I put on an entire suit and I just went and hung out with the radio guys because I wanted to do that. And then when I got to high school, we had a radio station. I lived in Missouri at the time, and I actually just shadowed them for an entire day. And I was like, this is what I want to do. I talked to them about maybe doing some intern stuff, and it never really quite worked out. And I eventually just ended up joining the military, and in through the military, I wanted to be on the radio, but you had to it was so weird. So they have the American Forces Network, and to get into that, before you even go to basic training, like you have to go through all these auditions and you have to do all kinds of stuff just to get in, just to get accepted. But my recruiter never told me any of that. My recruiter was a cop in the Air Force. And so he's like, you know what? I think you should be a cop. Basically what he was trying to say, I think you're stupid. And this is the only thing that you can do. So he talked me into being a cop. So I was like, okay. So I got into the Air Force. I ended up, I started out becoming a cop. But I always had in the back of my mind that I wanted to be on the radio. Now, thank God, while I was in training to be a cop, I dislocated my shoulder and had to have surgery. That was the best thing that ever happened to me. I will never be the strongest guy on the bench ever or in the military press, but I never had to be a cop because I'd have been a terrible cop. Because I never wanted to be that in my life. So,
Yeah.
So anyway, fast forward, I in 2013, 2014, I started to get sober, right? I had a really bad issue with alcohol up into that point. And then once I got sober, I started to kind of look back. I was 32 years old, and I started to look back on all the things that I wanted to do that I never got to do because I was either too scared or too nervous, or I lacked the ambition, or I just couldn't keep it together because of my alcoholism. So I started to venture into other things. I started training for pro wrestling, but unfortunately, because of a neck surgery, I couldn't get medically cleared, so I only made it to one practice. That was in San Francisco, by the way. It's and I'll tell that story one time. But yeah, that was actually with Sparky Ballard over in San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, at the Gold Rush Academy. And Thunder Rosa was there actually, and so was Hobbs, and so was God, Kratos and all these guys, they were all there. So I started to try that, but I couldn't get medically cleared. And then I ended up finding one of the things that I wanted to re-accomplish was try my hand at doing some boxing and MMA. And so I was like, okay, well, pro wrestling won't take me. So I'm just going to go and I'm going to train and I'm going to try to do some fight training. And then maybe one day I'll get a pro fight. So I go through there and I find this shady gym in Fairfield, California that did not require a medical questionnaire, that would just take me no matter what, as long as I paid my money. And I started training there, and it turns out I'm not a tough guy, and I'm not a great athlete. So, which I already knew from high school because I was a high school wrestler and I was terrible. But I was just like, you know what? Maybe now at age 32, maybe I can do some of this.
It's funny, and it's funny because if you were that terrible of a wrestler, how do you get matched up with a guy for your current podcast partner who coaches wrestling?
Yeah, I'm almost embarrassed to tell him that I might have won 2 matches in my entire high school career. When they would actually let me wrestle, a lot of times I was just getting water for other guys.
When I think we had to do some amateur wrestling stuff for PE in like the 7th or the 8th grade. And you know what I didn't like, and this is what I sort of realized, and why I really enjoy team sports, is that when it was one-on-one, and in wrestling, like, none of us really had any knowledge. We were just sort of trying to throw each other down. Yeah. And it just was about how much more you wanted to possibly give the other person pain. And I realized that I couldn't do that without thinking about it. And so when I would do the wrestling in PE, like I would have to like force myself to be okay with hurting this other person, possibly by dropping them on the ground. And I just couldn't do it. It was like a psychological breakthrough for me. So yeah. MMA, boxing, like I love doing the bag work, the shadow boxing. Like I still do shadow boxing today. If I need like, 15, 20 minutes of exercise, I'm throwing on, whatever wrestling I need to catch up on that. And I'm just shadow boxing for 20 minutes. I love that stuff. I can't jump rope anymore, unfortunately, which I also used to love because my right knee's so messed up. But the actual physical, like, can I hurt this other person? I couldn't break through that psychologically.
Yeah. I struggled with that too. And I really struggled with it when I was boxing and doing boxing sparring. And I just remember, I was nervous as hell. I was bigger than this one guy, and he was probably like 160 pounds, and I'm like, 190 at the time. So I outweighed him by quite a bit. But he was training. They wanted to position him to be a pro fighter because he was like 17 years old. And I'm a lot older than this kid. So we get in there and he's just lighting me up. And like my coach just gets into my face and he's calling me every name that you can think of and shoving me around a little bit. And I'm like, that's what I needed. He goes, if you don't start fighting back, this kid's going to kill you. Right.
Yeah.
And I put the kid down. Unfortunately for him, like he's 17, that might actually be assault, but yeah, I put him down and of all things, I put him down with a body shot. To this day, I don't even know how I landed it because I wasn't very skilled, but it was just like, I was in the corner and he's charging at me and he just got done lighting me up and he got a little cocky and left it open. And I just, boom, I hit him with a body shot, put his ass down. And he said, I'm done, coach, I'm done. And like, my coach was like, no, you guys keep going, but he could not physically go anymore. And I was just like, and afterwards I felt so bad for that kid. I was like, dude, I'm so sorry. He goes, why would you be sorry? I was kicking your ass. Like, I was hitting you with every shot. He goes, the only reason you didn't go down is because you're so much bigger and heavier than me. Yeah. Like he goes, no, thank you for hitting me with that shot because now I have a lesson to learn. I was like, oh, great.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I was doing all these things that I felt like I had missed out on with some of the crazy times that I had in my life. And then some friends of mine, Michael Gaspar and a guy named Fredo, they're there in the Central Valley in Exeter / Farmersville, California. And they started a fantasy football podcast essentially called cool. Garbage Time Points Podcast. So, and Fredo, he actually is a podcast producer. Like that's his job.
Oh, wow.
Right. I tried to bring him over to Fight Game, but he might cost us too much money. So because that's like his legitimate job, and he has some pretty good podcasts, and he's also a music video producer, and he does all kinds of stuff, documentaries, stuff like that. So and so he had like a legitimate professional setup there in his house. And so the guys would get over there and they were doing everything that I wanted to do. It was kind of set up like the Pat McAfee show where they had the one host and they would be kicking it to each guy, and they would call me and I would call into that show a lot. And we would, and I would mainly be talking fantasy football, which I happen to have a passion for. But then anytime there was a wrestling topic, of course they would bring me on. If there was a UFC topic, they'd bring me on. So I would be calling in every couple of weeks or so. And then there were some times where I was like the guest co-host, and I was just like, man, I think I could do this on my own. And so I talked to Fredo, and Fredo gave me some advice on what equipment I needed to buy and all this stuff, and sent me all the links and all the different programs I needed to set up. And then I got a hold of Joe because Joe had done radio because his older brother, which does, if you guys have listened to the Mike and JD show or Brace for Impact, like our breaking news bit and our Brace for Debate bit, that's his voice, and he made those at his station. His brother is like whatever they call it, production manager, program manager for the radio station. He also has done the morning show there for 20 years in Missouri. And Joseph would be their weekend guy, and he was doing like call in Tradio, and I think he even got prank called by Richard and Sal, but they never aired it, which is fantastic. He got prank called by me, of course. I used to prank call him while he was live on the air and ask him that I was selling all kinds of weird stuff. But so I knew he had the radio experience, and he's a big pro wrestling fan. So I was like, let's do a wrestling podcast. And so me and him talked, and the next thing you know, the Podcast Express was born, and we had a ton of fun with that show, man. But where we went wrong with it is we didn't really have like a plan. I was just like, I just wanted to do it, and then I'm just gonna get it done.
Yeah.
And then on my debut episode, my equipment wasn't even in at this point. I was still waiting for it to get shipped in, but Joe had agreed to be my co-host. And I was just like, well, if I'm going to do a podcast, I'm just going to do interviews with famous people, not really realizing that that's a whole process.
Yeah.
But so one day I just decided, I sent Conrad Thompson a direct message on the Wrestling Observer message board. Like, hey man, I have this podcast. I've been doing it for a while. I'd never actually done one, but, and it's called the Podcast Express. And I'd love to interview you and talk about your show with Bruce Pritchard. And he goes, yeah, of course, man, let's do it. And I was like, holy shit, he actually said yes. I never thought in a million years he would say yes. He was pretty famous at this point. This was 2017. And so, we exchanged messages, and then sure enough, I did the podcast. I had my equipment wasn't even there yet, but I had the engineer or the app on my computer, and I had a microphone, but I didn't have the little processor that I needed to hook everything up to my computer, because we didn't have Zoom and we didn't have StreamYard back then.
Yeah.
So I called him and I couldn't get anything to work. So what I did was I just put him on speakerphone, and I held the phone up to my microphone and I did it like that. It sounds like shit. Like, it sounds terrible. The audio is out there. The YouTube is still up, but it was terrible. But we did like 45 minutes, and I was just like, I think I could do this. And then eventually I got all the equipment that I needed, and we were on a roll. But we got to a point where one of the mistakes that we made is like, we were watching everything in order to talk about it, and what we were doing was a carbon copy of Dave and Brian.
Oh yeah.
We were trying to be Dave and Brian, but he and I had real jobs.
Yep.
I had a wife at this point. Dave and Brian, this is their job. Watching wrestling is what they do for a living, and then they talk about it, right? So I was trying to watch every Raw, every NXT, every SmackDown. We would try to watch as much New Japan. We weren't really watching Impact or TNA at the time. So we were trying to watch all this stuff, and we were doing UFC, and we would do UFC post shows. And it just got to like, I got so burnt out on watching wrestling that I didn't really watch an episode of Raw for like the next 2 years, because I was just sick of Raw and sick of anything WWE related. So, but we had that show for a good 6 months. It was fun, but I ended up moving, and a lot of stuff happened, and I took a break, and then next thing you know, I meet you.
Yeah, okay, so I do want to ask you about that, but
Yeah.
before I do, so you talked about Stern being an influence, Adam Carolla and Dr. Drew, and even how you how you end shows with the Mahalo.
Mhm.
That's a Adam Carolla thing. It's kind of
Yep.
funny what we use to do those things because mine is completely influenced by people that I've heard too. But the I think the thing that makes JD, your partner JD, who I hope to do one of these with, um, JD is a very serious dude. Like like if you talk to JD in person, JD is serious. Like he's not not that he's not a nice guy because he's a very nice guy, but he's like very serious, and you can see the wrestler inside of him when
Yeah.
you speak to him. He's an athlete. He's like a dude that he's kind of a big dude, and he's kind of intimidating a little bit. But what you are able to do with him to break him and to get him to kind of pull his guard down a little bit is actually fascinating. And I think that plays into why you guys are so good together. Because JD can also be very funny. JD can
Yeah.
also be goofy, but it is you as the lead doing that to get him a little looser because it doesn't seem as natural as it is for you. Now, where do you get the sense of humor? Where do you get the wit, the way that you're a shit stirrer by nature? Like, where
Yeah.
does that come from? Is that your parents? Is that sort of learned? Like, how did you become that person?
It's just something I've always had in me. Other big influences of mine were comedians, like at a very young age. Like we had HBO, and so I was kind of partly raised by the television, and some of the
Hmm.
people that raised me, besides Stern, were Sam Kinison and Andrew Dice Clay, George Carlin, of course. Martin Lawrence was one of my all-time favorites. I know he's a big favorite of yours. Chris
Yeah.
Rock, Richard Pryor, all these guys, and then a Def Comedy Jam and In Living Color, Saturday Night Live. So I kind of was just always gravitated towards comedy when I was a kid and funny movies. And my dad was always really funny. He told a lot of great jokes all the time, and he had 6 brothers, and so anytime that they would all get together, they were just nonstop, busting each other's balls. And my uncle Rocky, this would be Joseph's dad. He he was he was my uncle, but he was the youngest of 7, and he was like my babysitter when I was a kid. So he and I were really tight. He was more of a bigger brother,
Yeah.
and his wit really rubbed off on me. Like I became like a sarcastic, sometimes actually I can venture to being a jerk sometimes because people don't quite understand my humor. But he would be really sarcastic, and he would always like be crapping on his brothers because he was the baby and he couldn't
Yeah.
really fight them. So what he would do to get back at them was to make fun of them, and it was so funny that they couldn't get mad about it. And so I learned a lot of my humor from him, and that worked for me too, because growing up, like I tried to wrestle. I wasn't very good at it. I never really thought that I could kick anybody's ass. I felt like if I had to, I probably would hold my own, but I never wanted it to get to that point. So I always just tried to be funny at all times. And I always tried to be entertaining. In class, I was always kind of a class clown. And all through school, all growing up. And I was always the funny guy in the locker room because I was never the best athlete. So in order to get people to like me, I just tried my best to be funny. And I think where JD and I get along is because, he's probably hung around like those type of guys in locker rooms throughout his life, where it's like you always got like kind of the dumb jock humor.
Yeah.
And he's a jock, and I'm a failed jock. And I always, knew how to make those guys laugh. And I have, really gotten to know JD over these last almost 2.5 years now. And I know exactly. I had sometimes, most of the time, it's not planned. But there's sometimes, where I'm not going to tell JD is something specifically because I know for a fact it's going to get him to bust up laughing on the show. And it'll be something like inside or something like that. I know for a fact it's going to make him laugh, and it breaks him. And when you break JD, there's nothing like it. It's super funny. I broke him on the show this week because we had Salty Scott on.
Yep.
And his audio was terrible. Because he was on vacation. He wasn't expecting to be on the show. But I was like, man, I really want to have you on because JD had lost a bet to Scott
Yes.
the week before, saying that JD said that he never there was a 0% chance essentially that Jay that Jay Uso would pin Roman Reigns in the match, and he said he was so sure of that he would watch Raw for a month and NXT for 2 weeks. And so he lost that bet, and I was like, well, now Scott's got to come back on. So I got him at the last minute. So he just had his headphones in, which headphones, if your microphone's through your headphones, terrible.
It's bad.
Like it's really bad. So, and he's in this like beach house, and like there's other people in the house, and he's trying to go into a side room, and there's people watching the TV really loud. So he's trying to do a podcast, and I'm just like, I was like, Garrett's gonna kill me. So I kept muting him. Because it was just so bad.
Yeah.
And then I go, he was in the middle of a sentence like, hey, Scott, thank you for being on. I got to let you go because if I don't, Garrett's going to fire me before next week. and JD spit all over his computer, and it was a great moment. And I was really happy to be able to do that to him.
Now we may be going a little deep into the psychology of it all, but you know what I wonder about people who love kind of, being the person who's going to crack a joke, because like that cracking a joke kind of brings people together in a sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it also, at the same time, it can be invigorating for the person if you enjoy being the funny guy. Like it makes you likable, it makes you popular. And I wonder, when you were a kid, was that also a way to sort of be liked by other humans, was to be the funny guy? Or because sometimes when you're the funny guy, you can be very well liked, but at other times people can like not like you at the same time because sometimes you're making fun of others or whatever, and it could be a little, but does that, like in your personality, did that come from a place of like, oh, it's a way that people like me, like it's a way that people can know me as like this guy?
Yeah, no, that was the way it's a way for me to get accepted. And there has been times where my humor has gotten me in trouble. Because I can go to dark places in my humor, especially at a time, because there was a time where that was accepted, right? If you take a look at movies and radio shows and stuff from like 15 years ago or 20 years ago, you can go to dark places and that would make people laugh, but now you can't. And so that's gotten me in trouble. It's gotten me in some altercations. And then were times where I was like, in high school or after high school, where I was like being the funny guy. And then if I was the funny guy at somebody's expense, and if I went too hard or I went too long, then that would cause an issue between me and that person. And then I would feel bad because I never want to hurt anybody's feelings like that. Like, comedy's not about hurting people's feelings. It's about bringing everybody together, making everybody laugh. But sometimes if you go too hard or if you go too dark, it can absolutely hurt somebody's feelings. But that's always been my thing. Even in basic training, that I had tons of friends in basic training because I was constantly like trying to lighten the mood because we're all miserable. And so the best way to get out of that misery is to start cracking jokes and making fun of each other. And then every tour, like in Afghanistan, both tours, like those could be miserable if you're not, willing to make each other laugh, if you're not willing to have fun with each other. And so that's kind of been my way to not only find acceptance, but it's been my way, like in dark situations, to kind of bring a little bit of light to them. Right. And I've always been that way. No matter at what point in my life, even at sad times in my life, like I will try to inject a little bit of humor into it. I had an uncle die recently, and he was in our fantasy football league, and one of my cousins was playing him in fantasy football that week and beat him, and I was just like, really? You couldn't let him get it this week, like that type of stuff, right? And then everybody just starts, the group chat that we had, everybody just starts dying laughing. It was so great. But so I always try to have some type of humor in any type of situation.
So one thing, because the Dice Clay thing, I was like thinking about Dice Clay, and I'm like, yeah. But you've got to be like 5 or 6 years younger than me, maybe even more. So for you to see Dice Clay, because if I think about it, I was like 13 or 14 when I saw Dice Clay. So like you were young to actually see some of Dice Clay's humor.
Oh yeah, well, my parents kind of let me get away with a lot, because my parents were really young when they had me. They didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah.
And then my dad was a cable guy for a little while, And let's just say after he left the cable company, he knew how to get us cable
Yeah.
and all the channels that we wanted, no matter where we lived. Okay.
The black box
And
is awesome.
yeah, yes. And so when they would go to sleep, I would always kick on HBO, and HBO would replay stuff, and so would Showtime and Cinemax and all these. They would replay a lot of that stuff, and so and then my friend Matt Tristo, he actually had the Dice Clay albums, and his dad was very similar in that he was kind of like an uncensored, unfiltered dad, and he just felt like, that's just the way it had to be. So we were allowed to listen to R-rated stuff and allowed to watch R-rated stuff, and so it just wasn't really a big deal in like the 80s and 90s. That was just like an accepted part of it. I mean, I watched Eddie Murphy. I watched Delirious with my dad, right? Like the first time I watched it, I was probably 12 years old, and I watched it with him because I was a big fan of Beverly Hills Cop, and so I saw the video cassette at the video store, and he had that red jumpsuit on, that red leather jumpsuit. And I was like, oh, what's this? I was thinking it might be a movie. And it turns out it's just him just slaying the entire audience for an hour straight with some of the greatest comedy that you'll ever hear in your life. And I watched it with my dad at a young age. And my dad, it reminds me of the Me, Myself, and Irene. Have you watched that movie before?
I know. I don't know if I've ever seen it all the way through, but I know of the
so
movie,
it's got Jim Carrey, right? And he's got the split personality, and he has he's a white guy. His wife is white, but she cheated on him with a black guy, and then she ends up leaving him after she gives birth to these three boys that are all biracial, right? And he's got to raise these three boys by himself, and so he just puts on the TV, and they're watching Richard Pryor, and he's like, "Oh my God, this is inappropriate." But the boys are loving the joke so much, he's just like, well, I can't turn it off because they're so happy. It was kind of one of those situations, right? So it's like and then my dad would always tell me, well, don't tell your mother, son. And that was kind of like our secret thing.
Yeah.
Now, if my mom was around, that stuff wouldn't fly.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So people ask me, like, if a movie was made between, or I'll say if it came out on video between like 94 and like 97, 98, I probably haven't seen it because I worked at Blockbuster Video and they had these trailer tapes that we had to play all day long. So something like Me, Myself, and Irene, there would have been a, 45-second segment of that movie that I've seen 1,000 times. And so I never would want to watch the actual movie because I just have a bad memory of having to. So the movies, like my buddy hit me up the other day, and he showed me his 4K DVD of Casino, and he's like, "Have you seen Casino?" I've like, no, I haven't sat through Casino before, but man. I just remember the double tapes that I would have to rent out all the time, and the things on the trailer. So. Like, yeah, I have there are movies from that time frame that I've absolutely missed out on because I just get like this weird feeling when I even think about watching them because of working for Blockbuster Video back in the day. All right, so let's talk about how you came to this network. Now you're gonna have to help me out because I was just talking to Justin Nipper. Justin Nipper's, write that down. They are leaving the network on the recent Fight Game podcast that I put out. He and I did about 20 minutes just to kind of talk about his run with us and how we got to write that down and all that stuff. And so he filled in some of the hazier memories for me because, a lot of this stuff that happened was just the byproduct of the pandemic and all of us all of a sudden having like a lot more free time. And so he reminded me that he and JD did a show called High Tension on the Patreon. Yeah, and I totally forgot about High Tension because when I think about the Patreon and I think about JD, I think about Brace for Impact. Like that's where my mind goes. And speaking of Brace for Impact, I even got the I have the coffee mug that I'm drinking the tea of today in the Brace for Impact mug. So recant kind of how you came in, you came into the network through, I'm sure, like through the Facebook and the Twitter and all that stuff. Yeah. And, from Wrestling Observer, like remind me how we all got you together with us.
Yeah. So I think you and I started following each other on Twitter because I was following you because you were on the Wrestling Observer Radio and I was a big fan. And we kind of bonded over the 49ers. So that's when and I wore my gear because I'm on your show today. Um, wearing Navarro Bowman. That's how
Yes.
obscure I get sometimes. But so so we started following each other like that, and we got to be a little bit friendly. And then you invited me to join the Fight Game Media Facebook group. And then I became kind of a frequent poster in that Facebook group. Well, around the same time, I started to really, I was feeling this void creatively, right? That was being filled by my podcast, the Podcast Express. And I hadn't done anything like that in 2 years. So this is probably 2019 and before the pandemic. And I wanted to start writing and I just didn't know where to do it. And Josh Nason of the Wrestling Observer posted in the Fight Game Facebook group that they were looking for somebody to do some recaps. And I was just like, okay, I could do that. And I'm like, if I'm going to start anywhere, I'm going to start at the top. I'm going straight to the Observer, right? And so I shot him an email and I sent him some work that I had done previously. None of it was recap stuff, though. It was like I'd done some writing for the Garbage Time Points podcast website. They had done some blogs, and so I did some blogs for them too. While I did a little bit of podcasting, and one of the things I did was an obituary on Bobby the Brain Heenan that everybody really liked. It actually got a lot of clicks back in the day. So I sent that over to him, and he said, "Well, that's not exactly what we're looking for, but keep writing and do some recaps, and then let me see some of your recap work, and then we'll be interested in the future." I was like, "Okay, cool." But I didn't really know where to start doing that. I didn't really know where to even begin, and I was just like, screw it, I'll just create my own website. And I'm just very much of like, if I get an idea, I'm just like, screw it, I'm just gonna do it. I'm just gonna figure it out. So I started Googling around, and I talked to my friend Fredo, who's usually a guy I can lean on when it comes to tech stuff. And I got a WordPress site, and then I created my own website called the Combat Republic. And at the same time, I was watching all of these website accounts and these fan accounts on Twitter that were getting Fight TV codes for free. And I was just like, man, I had won a couple of contests. I was like, I should be doing those contests, right? And so I was like, so I created this website, and it had to be like a legit looking website to get them to kind of want to give me these codes, right?
Right.
So I converted my old Podcast Express Twitter account into the Combat Republic. I reached out to Fight. I immediately, they said, yeah, look, sounds great. They didn't even question it. They were like, yeah, you sound like a legit guy. So, I reached out to Fight, and I immediately did a recap of a Ryzen Fury fighting pay-per-view, the MMA promotion in Japan. I did a contest for them, where I got a code and a lucky winner got a code. And then I stayed up late and watched it overnight. And then I recapped the whole thing. And I loved Ryzen's a great promotion, by the way. If they were a bit more accessible, if they were like on TV, I think they would do pretty well because they're just crazy. I like on that one. I watched a 30-year-old man do Brazilian jiu-jitsu against a 13-year-old girl. Right? Like, and he ended up. It was like a jiu-jitsu competition. He did like 4 people, and one of them was a girl, and he took it very easy on her. He didn't hurt her, but so I did that.
That was Kenny Omega, man.
Yeah, yeah. And so I did that recap, and I recapped a couple more things for them using my fight codes and using their PPV platform. And I got my website started, and I just was bored to tears by recapping. I was like, this is the dumbest thing.
I hate doing it, actually. Like you look at the people who actually are on Wrestling Observer, like I think the guy that does Dynamite, I think his name is Ryan Howard.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, he is able to name all of these moves that I still don't even know necessarily what they're called when like imagine now we're recording this on Sunday, and Collision was on Saturday night, and there was a really good match between FTR and Jay White and Juice Robinson. Now, Excalibur is kind of the king of calling everybody's move the name that they use, even though like a lot of these moves are just very similar, right?
Yeah.
And so, but Ryan Howard also, that's how he recaps. And I'm just thinking, like, I would have to spend so much time hitting pause, going into like searching wrestling moves, remembering, oh yeah, that's what it's called, then writing it. But he's doing it in real time. And the way that I recap is I kind of recap. I like summarize like what's the story of the thing, but that's not what they want. They want the actual play by play in, in written form. And so I hate it. I hate doing it, but the people who do it really well, they are talented at not
Yeah.
only being very quick, but at recollection. Like I can't tell you what every, second or third move that FTR does. I mean, I see it and I go, "Oh yeah, that's one of their moves," but I can't think of the name, whatever the name is, but I find that to be fascinating, and it's really hard, but like you said, it's really tedious. I'd rather just talk about it than write it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And it was just a skill set that I didn't have. And I'd never had the attention span for something like that. So I did a couple and it just sucked. But I found my niche doing just like when news would break, I would, it was kind of an aggregation, but I tried to make it my own. And I would like say, here's what the story is, and here's who's wrote about the story. Here's some of the details, very short. And then I would do a section down below with Mike's take, basically kind of ripping off Jason Powell from ProWrestling.net. I
Mhm,
always liked that about him, where he would tell you what happened, and then he would give his opinion. And I was like, he
mhm.
was making it his own, and I
Is he still
appreciate
doing
that.
stuff?
He still does stuff, yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. He's still
For
he's
some
he's he's
reason,
still
he's
out there.
fallen off my radar. I don't see his stuff it could be like a Twitter thing or something.
Yeah, I don't think he's that active on Twitter, but ProWrestling.net's still out there, and he still does a great job. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to do that because I respect people who make things their own, right?
Mhm.
Because you get these aggregate websites out there that are just like they'll take a snippet of a story, create a salacious headline, and then throw a ton of ads in there, and then
Yeah,
just try to
they're
get
throwing in
clickbait.
Google keywords so that
Yeah,
it's just
yeah.
more about the ranking than it is about the writing.
Right. So I just started to do that, and I was just trying to build like a resume to hopefully get Josh Nason's attention, right? And I started to really become successful writing about Impact, because Impact, they were down in the dumps. They were on Access. Nobody was really watching it, and the people that were watching it, like on some of the bigger websites, they were only watching it because it was their job. You can tell that not it's not that they weren't enjoying it, because the shows, I felt, especially their bigger shows, are always pretty enjoyable. It's just so unimportant. Like they
Yeah, the
know that
priority
nobody
is
is.
is low.
Yeah. And so what I tried to do is like, okay, well, everybody's talking about WWE, everybody's talking about UFC, but nobody's really talking about Impact. AEW hadn't really been around yet. I think they were coming out later that year. And so I was like, I'm going to try to make my focus Impact, because people seem to really want this information. So when stories would break about Impact, I would treat it with dignity. Like I wouldn't say, yeah, here Impact had a show, but nobody cares. Like, because I felt like that attitude was coming from Dave and it was coming from Keller and all these other guys. And so I would watch their shows, and I wouldn't recap, but I would just give my opinion of the shows. And then when news stories would break, I would write about those news stories, and I would interject my opinion, and then I would always try to interject my humor. I would really just try to, I'd throw in some sarcasm, I'd make fun of stuff. And my columns started to get pretty popular, and I started to get a little bit of a following in that Impact community. And I was actually like Impact Fan Podcast. They would like reach out to me, and I would do their podcast and stuff, and they would always do pretty good numbers because my columns were doing pretty good numbers. And so eventually, when I was like, well, okay, I got to go with the stuff that works, right? The
Yeah.
stuff that people are enjoying. So I just kind of made that my niche. I just kind of carved out a niche for myself. I was like, I think this is the way I'm going to find myself into the space. And hold on. So I just try to make that to where I can get into the space. And eventually I started bugging you about coming onto your show with John LaRocca, and to get on your show and talk some Impact. But we were trying to work it out. I had done some UFC stuff with you, but I really wanted to talk about Impact because I knew I could do numbers for you.
Yeah.
We kept talking. You said, well, hey, why don't you write some columns for me? And I was like, okay, cool. I could write some columns. And I did a couple, and they did pretty good numbers for you. And so to where we started to do a weekly column, and then all of a sudden we started to do like, 2 columns a week. And like, I would do extra columns. Like I called it Brace for Impact, and it would come out every week, and it was always pretty successful. And because they were so successful, we kind of parlayed that into a podcast. Like Jeremy Feinstein hit me up. He's like, why don't we do a podcast, man? He's like, me, you, and JD will do Sacrifice. This was in the pandemic, 2020. And next thing you know, like Jeremy Feinstein's idea, like, hey, let's all do a podcast together and we'll talk about sacrifice. We did, and the next thing you know, me and JD kind of clicked there, and we just hit the ground running, and we had a pretty good show for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry about that. I had to answer a text.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Just let the viewers and listeners know off air. Mike and I were talking about how our wives are actually out of town, and our kids are actually out of town. So any communication that we have with our significant others is through text. So that's why we're both like just keeping our texts in front of us.
She actually called me, and I know she's driving right now, and I had to ignore the call and just shoot her some text. Like, I'm not trying to ignore you.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. So Brace for Impact happens. You and JD do the show on Impact, and really for us, we're trying to figure out a way to be different, and having a hardcore Impact show is one of those ways, because like you said, it's kind of like the fourth or fifth priority on these bigger websites. And then the column was there, and one thing that you're very good about, and you like, a lot of people won't do this because of feedback, but you share your stuff in many places, to the point of where people may be going like, hey dude, you probably shouldn't share this link all every single time. But like, a lot of people don't do that because they're so worried about negative feedback and how it affects them. But you were sharing your stuff all over the place and getting people to click. And it's funny because there are people who are in our Discord now who I remember like retweeting everything that you've written, because they are just that big of a fan, and they kind of help you, do the legwork. It's the part of having a community, right? Is you got kind of make people feel close, and you give them a little bit of yourself, and they want to help you succeed. So that kind of came out of that as well, which I always found fascinating. You were able to get people to post things for you just because they liked you, and they liked the work, and they liked having that little bit of, I can DM Mike and he's going to answer me. So of course I'm going to share his stuff. He's a good guy.
Yeah. Well, they would DM me, and I would get DMs criticizing my work. But when they would, when I see people like on Twitter specifically, and they're usually more bigger name, when people are criticizing them, like on commenting on their stuff, and they're saying bad things about it, they will just go nuclear on them, right? And I was doing the opposite. Like there was a couple of times where someone made a personal attack, but if they were attacking like my work, or they're saying, hey, that's not true, I would just have a conversation with them.
Yeah.
And then I would get some DMs, and I would start building a little bit of a relationship with some of these folks, and I'll kind of become friends with them after a while, because I'm like, look, I was treating them like a real human being, right? And I've seen some other people like, hey, this isn't a real person, so I'm just going to destroy them. And they will, like, especially there's guys out there with tons of followers that will quote tweet somebody and say, and there's like, hey, well, you follow me, you must be a dork, you must be a loser, you must sleep in your grandma's basement, all this stuff. And I'm just like, I was doing the opposite. Unless somebody took a shot at my family, I never really saw the point. I would just try to have a conversation with them. And then it got to a point where the criticisms became constructive. Right. I actually built a friendship with this guy, BQ, who does the Impact Lounge. And he's also a military guy. And you could tell he's a sergeant, because he would be like, hey, man, you got a typo here. he's like, hey, man, you got the date wrong on this deal. And then like he would help edit for me. Right.
Yeah.
And so like we were doing that. And then like I ended up doing his podcast a bunch of times. And so we've become like personal friends through that. So I even created a Brace for Impact chat, just talking with some of the members of the folks that were listening to the show and that had been reading my stuff for years and that had been sharing my stuff. And one of the guys has become a good friend of mine, God Illa. He's a rapper out of Boston, and I played some of his music on the show before, and so I've gotten to know him really well. And this other guy, Gerard, is super crazy about Impact. He shared my stuff everywhere. Now he writes for Body Slam, so he's actually gotten a gig now. Right. Yeah. So he's actually becoming kind of a big deal. So I got this whole cool community out there of people that just really liked the show and liked my columns and liked my sense of humor. And they had a similar sense of humor, and they didn't take themselves and they didn't take Impact too seriously to where we couldn't have a conversation.
So you and JD made the transition this year to go away from solely talking about Impact, and this is my sense of it. And tell me if I'm wrong or right. y- there were opportunities for you guys to have a take on a specific story that might have been different from how our AEW podcast would see
Mhm.
something or how our WWE podcast would see something, but you were kind of unable to do so because your focus was on Impact. So the Mike and JD show sort of comes out of that and being like, hey, like, you know, instead of being limited by only Impact, we want to talk about some of these other bigger stories too, including, you know, CM Punk fighting with the Elite and stuff like,
Yeah.
you know, and so instead of just having like the Impact beat, it really felt like, oh, like these guys, you know, they want to take what they've done with Impact and just broaden it out about wrestling. But at the same time, and you kind of reference this with you and Joe, um, it is a little bit harder because you have to follow more stuff. And I don't know how
Yeah.
that has affected what you guys do, but that was sort of my take on why you guys wanted to switch it up.
Yeah, so on Brace for Impact, when we found our niche, where we found that our show was more entertaining when we were talking about topical headlines, and the Impact headlines had run dry essentially, like, and we were trying to think of obscure topics to talk about, and then after a while, it became like we were just kind of talking about stuff for the sake of creating content, right? And we were getting bored with only talking about the same company. And all these interesting and fascinating things were coming out of WWE and AEW and New Japan, of which we were still fans of. And so we wanted to talk about those things. So we started to incorporate it. We did like a slow roll. We're like, hey, look, tonight we're going to talk about whatever's in the news. And then we will get to the Impact portion of the show. And so we started to do that about 6-8 months before the Mike and JD show debuted. And it got to where the topical stuff was doing better than our Impact reviews. But we felt like we were being limited because people only saw us as the Impact guys
Mm-hmm.
because our name was Brace for Impact. So there's like, why would we listen to the Impact guys talk about AEW when Impact is such a low priority viewing thing? Like we are somehow associated with Impact. It's like, hey, because they watch Impact, then their opinions over here aren't as valid, right? Like we would get people to say that. If I criticized AEW, then someone would say, "Well, what do you know? You watch Impact." I'm just like, "I watch AEW too, you idiot." Right? It's like I watch the 49ers and I watch the New York Giants. Why can't I
Right.
have an opinion on both, right?
Right.
So it's like, and it's because I'm not a stupid moron. So
Danny
but I would get
Dimes.
some, yeah. So I would start getting some of those comments, and so JD and I talked for a while, and then this year the Impact show just started to kind of just fall off. Like 2022 was such a great year for that program. Like I would say they had 50 episodes because they took a couple weeks off, and I would say 40 of them were pretty damn good, right? Like 40 of them were highly enjoyable, and then the other 10 were just okay or they were bad. And then all of the pay-per-views and the premium events I felt were always really, really good. But then 2022 rolls around. They start off doing pretty good with their January pay-per-view, Hard to Kill. And then Josh Alexander got hurt, and Mickey James got hurt, and then some other folks, their contracts expired, and they ended up leaving the promotion. Like Matt Cardona left, and all this stuff's going on, and the writing just started to fall off, and like the program just became harder and harder to watch and harder to enjoy, to where I didn't really look forward to recapping it because I knew I might have to be negative, and I want this to be a fun experience for the audience. So, and you can only make fun of the product so much before you start to get sick of it. And people came to us, yes, because we were making fun of it, but we were also treating it with dignity. Now we're getting to the point where we're not treating it with dignity. And JD had gotten to the point where he was just like flat out, he didn't want to watch it anymore. And so we just started to really focus in on the topical headlines, and then the Impact review. We were just doing it because the name was Brace for Impact, right? It just stopped being fun at that point. And so eventually we made the call. We took some time off, and then we was like, Mike and JD show, let's do it. And we just started talking about topical headlines. I don't watch every show, and I freely admit that. I watch Dynamite. I still watch Impact, but I probably watch Impact like Friday mornings or Saturday mornings.
Mhm.
But we're just really, and I watch the WWE monthly shows, and I watch Collision now. I started to try to add Collision. I've missed one episode, but I don't feel like I'm forced to watch every single show because I'm not really commenting on all the matches. I'm not really commenting on all the storylines. We're talking about the news,
Yep.
right? So if CM Punk's being a jerk backstage, I can comment on that without watching, CM Punk in an 8-man tag,
Yeah.
right? Like if the Young Bucks are being pansies backstage, I can talk about that all day without ever seeing any of their matches. So, and still having a baseline knowledge. So it's actually been more enjoyable for me because I can skip the stuff that I don't like. And with Impact, I wasn't able to skip the stuff that I don't like because I felt like I owed it to the audience to be able to give them an educated opinion about the segments that I've seen. But now when Dango or Santino rolls up on my TV, I can hit that old fast forward button. And then on AEW, I've always enjoyed that because when someone that I don't really care for comes on the TV, like QT Marshall, not today, brother. I'm skipping that. Right. I haven't watched Rampage in like almost a year. I don't care. Nobody cares about Rampage. I'm not going to watch that show. I don't have to watch that show. If your hobby is getting to a point where you're starting to get sick of it, just do something else or just limit it. Right.
Yeah.
And that's what I've done. And it's actually made for a more enjoyable show. But I still love Brace for Impact. I thought that was kind of my baby. That was kind of like what where I got back into the groove, and I still feel like a loyalty to that audience. So I'm still doing some Brace for Impact stuff. I don't know if anybody's listening, but I know that I'm still doing it, and because I still enjoy it. And I get to do I just do it by myself now, and I do it like on the weekends and stuff like that. And I still have a connection with a lot of the Impact audience, but I don't feel like I have to watch literally every single segment of every show that they do, which I had to do before.
I mean, it's a great point that you made about how it's sort of like when you're covering a beat, you kind of have to be the master of it. You have to be the genius of it all and know everything. And recently, John and I always joke with John that, the Fight Game podcast has been in existence, gosh, probably for like 5 or 6 years now in this. It was something different before, but this current version. And we've changed how we do it at least 5 or 6 times. And recently, our advantage being on F4W was we would go up Wednesday night. So if I could get that show up before Dave and Brian actually get their show up, our AEW recap is kind of the first one. Our Dynamite recap is the first one. And we were way more, microscopic in our discussion and our criticisms. Dave and Brian's pretty, still, they weren't diving too deep into small things that, that John and I would. But what happens is, unless going up against Dave and Brian on that night, we were going to be low priority on people's lists. If we could get the RSS up earlier than them, then maybe we would get some listeners. But at the same time, from a promotion standpoint, from the website, they're going to get Dave and Brian up immediately, and our show's not going to be on the website. It's for like another 12 hours or whatever. So that was really hard. So then we moved the show to Thursday once the pandemic was sort of under control, and there's a possibility that I was going to have to start going to work a little bit more into the office. We moved it to Thursday night. And so at that point, it was like, why are we even talking about Dynamite in the way that we were? It's a day later. And we're being very microscopic about this show that is already, everyone's review has already been out for 24 hours or whatever. So then we decided, okay, we're going to pull back, and now we're going to make it about a broader, like 5 things that we want to talk about, and we'll just focus on those 5 things. So like you said, now if Orange Cassidy's got his hands in his pants throughout the picture-in-picture, I just fast forward it, right? I don't need to watch it. If like you said, QT, like, some of that QTV stuff, I'll just watch it for its goofiness. But yeah, I don't have to watch and take notes on every little thing that happened. And now I feel like a freer person when I do that show, because it's more sort of like, how do you bring topical things into a conversation? Now, there are some people who are like, oh, you guys were like the hardest people ever on Dynamite. I miss that. I'm like, yeah. There was some aspect of that for us to being where especially being on that website, because Dave and Brian, pretty much like AEW TV for on most occasion. And so to be a little bit harder on that show, it did separate us a little bit. And for for Tony Leader, who runs that website, he's like, yeah, I like it because they can't say that, we only talk positively about AEW when you guys are on the thing. So,
Yeah.
but at the same time, our critiques, we would get a lot of negativity about them. Oh, you guys are just haters,
Oh,
and
La Rock is a heat magnet, big time. Like, oh my gosh.
My favorite thing is on the same show, if I get feedback that I'm in the bag for AEW or I hate AEW on the same
Yeah.
show, I'll get the feedback from both sides. So that tells me I'm probably doing properly, being in the middle on it. So, but no,
Yeah.
I think it's been a great thing for you. But also, and here's the other thing about podcasting in general or creating content, it's not great to be in a rut. So if you
Mhm.
feel like you're in a rut, I call it's a living experiment. Like you don't have to do the show the same way every week. You can change it up and you could learn from the change. And is this positive or is this negative? We can always go back to what we were doing. So the creative experience for you guys, it feels like you guys got some juice out of simply changing your rundown. And that's great for the listeners because they hear a more enthused Mike and JD.
Yeah, and the format does change like slightly because we will have guests on some weeks, and I'll bring the guest on. Sometimes they're there for the whole thing, or sometimes they're there to talk about something specific, right? And I'll have them come on. Sometimes I've had multiple guests because we'll shoot the link out there and we'll have a couple people on. Some weeks we'll start with some WWE talk. Some weeks it'll be AEW, but we never really pigeonhole ourselves to where we can't talk about this outside stuff. One week we got to talk about aliens, and I love talking aliens, right? And the numbers didn't do great, but I still had a fun time talking about it. JD has like a passion for like the television business, right?
Yep.
And where it's headed. So I've actually started to study that more because we've been deep diving into these actual television business talks and stuff. We'll talk about HBO Max, and we'll talk about streaming and all this other stuff. We'll get into movies and stuff, and we can kind of venture off into our own thing to where like it doesn't matter the topic as long as we can speak intelligently on it, and as long as we can be entertaining, we're going to bring it in while still keeping pro wrestling as our base, right? And I don't even have to put the show together until like Thursday, and I'll just kind of look like I'll have some topics throughout the week that I'll be thinking about. JD and I will text, and then we have like a Google Doc where we both can update it, and he'll throw some topics in there. I usually handle the format, and it's easy, it's free flowing, and sometimes like I'll have like 15 things on the format, but if we get too long winded on some of the other stuff, I'll just skip over them and good. The only thing that people get mad about me changing is if I don't start with "Hey Now" and if I don't end with "Mahalo." They like one time I didn't end with "Mahalo" and Godilla said, "What the hell is wrong with you? Why didn't you?" I didn't know that the show was over because I didn't hear you say "Mahalo." So I try to keep that the same, but everything that's in between is kind of free flowing. We can do whatever we want.
So for people who are interested in doing podcasts, Mike dropped a couple gems there. Learning a new thing or researching more into a thing to better balance the conversation with your partner is fantastic because the conversation is better with more knowledge. And I can give you an example because Brian and Dave, that show that they do, that is the pro wrestling show on the internet. Like it is the main, like if from a recap and business sense. Now people may go, oh, this Bruce Pritchard show, from an entertainment standpoint or from like an old tales or an old legend standpoint, there are people who will go to those kind of shows. But I'm talking about the industry of professional wrestling. The Dave and Brian show, Wrestling Observer Radio, is the #1 show for importance, for information, for people who have to scrape information to post on their websites. That's the first thing that they're listening to. So for me to come in and have to do a show with Dave where for Since 2005, or even before then, IATA. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Dave was hosting those. Brian wasn't hosting them until he had his own website. But for that show to not start with "How's it going, everybody?" Like people are like, "What the f?" Like when they hear my
Mm-hmm.
voice, they're like, "What the hell?" So I have to differentiate from Brian. I can't go and do what Brian does, which is just set Dave up to go talk and to recap these shows in the humorous way that he does. I had to do something way different. And learning about the TV industry and the streaming industry, and having a sports element to that is the way that I've been able to differentiate from Brian. So now people go, "Oh, the Friday wrestling." That's how they explain it to me. It's like not that, "Oh, I can't wait for Wrestling Observer Radio." They go, "I can't wait for Friday Wrestling Observer Radio," because that's the show
Yeah.
that Dave and I do. So
Yeah.
to be able to, it is good for just your quality as a broadcaster to dig in on certain things that you think may help. I can talk about certain things that Brian doesn't have an interest in. Like Brian doesn't like sports at all, so he doesn't care about how the NFL is doing something or how the NBA is doing something, right? Like this is not his interest.
Mm-hmm.
His interest is, wrestling and MMA and jiu-jitsu and you know, uh, gymnastics. Like he can talk gymnastics with anybody. So just being able to differentiate and to make it your own, very valuable in this world. And I talked to John Alba about this not too long ago, and he said that's his number one advice. Like, how do you do a show and differentiate it from every other thousands of shows that are out there, which is good advice for you, folks who are podcasting and folks who are interested in podcasting. We've already been talking for a while, so I have 3 questions that I kind of want to
Okay.
ask you.
Yeah.
And we have 3 questions from the Patreon, or not the Patreon, from the Patreon. Some of them are from Patreon subscribers, but just from the Discord. So I'll go with those first. Some of them,
Okay.
I'm sure, are a little bit inside, and you may have to explain what
R-
the question actually is.
Okay.
The first one, from guest of your show, John Muse.
I already know what this is about. This is funny.
When do you plan to watch Banshee? This is John Muse's favorite show because he's
No.
actually talked to me about the show as well.
Yeah. No. So I think he wanted me to ask you
Oh,
when are
oh, is
you
that what it
going to
was?
watch
Oh, yeah,
Banshee?
okay,
Because
okay, that's what it was.
he talked me into watching Banshee, and I love that
You
show.
loved
And
it.
now, yeah, no, I'm in season 3 right now, and I absolutely love it. Like
Okay,
it's a
where
fascinating
can
show.
I find that show?
Max.
Oh, it's on Max.
Yeah, it's on HBO Max. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
So I've been watching it. It's but it was a Cinemax show, so you have to be careful who is around when you're watching it
There you
because
go.
of it's Skinemax. They had shoehorned in some sexual content,
Yeah.
but if you got rid of that, like you almost have like the perfect action TV show. It's an action, and like the storytelling is just fantastic. Like I've never seen anything like it. Actually, it kind of reminds me of like The Shield and those types of shows on FX in like the early 2000s.
Mhm.
Like it's very violent, it's vulgar, but the storytelling is incredible, and the way that they connect all the dots in this show, it's fantastic. I love it so much. I can't recommend it more.
Okay, so here's what I'll say to Muse, which is I am currently watching the Mayor of Easttown, which is Kate Winslet in like a true detective kind of story. And I'm at the end of it. It was only 7 episodes. I'm at the end of it. I thought it was really good. I'm also watching Succession very slowly. I'm only in season 2 of Succession. So I will add this show to my list of slow watches. It's going to take me years to finish
Yeah.
everything, but I will add it to the rotation sometime this week, because with my wife being away is actually the time to watch a show like that, because that's not something she would necessarily be too interested in. But with her gone, I can actually get. Oh, at least I'll watch the first episode this week. So that's how
Yeah.
that's what I'll do for Muse, because Muse has been talking to me about that show since I met him.
Yeah, yeah. He absolutely loves it, and he turned me on to it, and I'm so glad he did because I've really enjoyed it.
Okay, from Discord member JMess3035 says, I'd love to know more about Mike's background and entry into wrestling criticism. Did it start with Impact, or did he just love Impact and had to get his thoughts out somewhere? So we kind of explained that
Yeah.
already in your origin, but I thought his question about wrestling criticism, is that actually how you see the discourse? Do you see it as, when I watch this thing, my first intention is to criticize it, or are you just sort of trying to explain what's going on? How do you see it?
I do criticize stuff and I do criticize things a lot. I don't really see it as that. I just see it as me giving my honest opinion. And I try my best to be fair, and I try my best to not show a bias, although I do have certain biases. I know I do. But how did I get my entry into it? The Shadow Man talk on professional wrestling on Squared Circle. I would listen to him, right? And he was talking about WCW and WWF and ECW. And my friends and we would have the same conversation. So we were like, hey, we like this match. Hey, this match sucked. This promo sucked. This was great. We were talking like that already. And then I heard him talk about it in depth from an insider perspective. And I started to listen to him.
Do you know,
and then
is that person still around?
James Boone, I'm friends with him on Facebook.
No way.
Yeah. Dude, so funny. So somebody posted in the F4W, the Squirt, or the Wrestling Observer message board, like, hey, does anybody know what's going on with the Shadow Man? Where is he these days? And I saw some comments on there, and then somebody linked me to some of his shows on YouTube. The shows live on YouTube. Somebody actually used to record them and eventually uploaded them. So I started to listen back because I was like, man, there was a couple of episodes when I was a teenager that I called into. Like, I called into the show and I talked to Shane Douglas and I talked to Yokozuna and I talked to some other folks. So I started to go back and start listening to some of the shows, and I posted them online. And then somebody DM'd me and said, hey, did you know that the Shadow Man is on Facebook? I was like, I didn't know that. So linked me to his Facebook. I went to his Facebook. I added him there. And then I sent him this heartfelt message about how he was such a big influence on me, and that I'm doing podcasting now. And it was, maybe it was a too long don't read, because he just gave me the thumbs up, and that was it. That's all I ever heard from the guy. But but the fact that I'm Facebook friends with him is still kind of a big deal to me. He's not a famous guy or anything, but he was just like, you never really know how you're going to influence people, especially like when young people are watching your show in their formative years. They're going to remember that later. Like, if somebody's 40 and they're a fan of your show, it's probably not going to resonate with them. But when they're 14, right, you're kind of shaping some of their worldview. So you got to respect that, right? Because in 20 years they might grow up and reach out to you, like, hey, look, I listened to you, I read your stuff, and you were an influence on me. And so, yeah. So I started with that, and then I got into the wrestling, website discourse and stuff. I was a PW Insider guy. I was a OneWrestling.com guy, and then I ventured over into PW Insider, and I was on their message board a little bit when I was stationed in Japan. But when I was stationed in Japan, that's where I started to get into the Wrestling Observer, because I heard Wrestling Observer live on. No, I was stationed in Korea. Sorry, 2011. Stationed in Korea, and I heard Wrestling Observer live. I heard Brian Alvarez on the radio, on the American Forces Network, while I was driving around base, and I started to get into him, and then that's when I made the jump over to the Wrestling Observer, and I've been a subscriber for a long time now. But I've always just been like that. I talk shit about football, like I criticize movies. I like to give my opinions on baseball. Like, I just have always been like that, and I've never really been the type of guy, like, if you like 100% of something 100% of the time, I don't really think you're capable of critical thought. Right, you're an empty-headed idiot, like CM Punk would say. So I've always just been like, hey, this was good, this wasn't, and that's never going to change. That's always going to be about me. When I get food, hopefully everything on that plate's good, but there might be something that I don't like about it, and I'm going to talk about it. You know what I mean?
Do you think that mentality that people have of, like you said, football, if you're like, oh shoot, I hate the Dallas Cowboys, like, it's sort of inferred because you're wearing this 49er jersey.
Yeah.
And sports teams are tribal by nature. And
Mhm.
so it's just like, oh yeah, he's, he of course he hates the Cowboys. He's a 49ers
Yeah,
fan. But if you
absolutely.
say, you know, why the F is Sean Spears on my TV? Why do AEW fans, not all of them obviously, but why do a subset of AEW fans go, oh, he must hate AEW?
They're super sensitive. They see it as their sports team, right? They see like a lot of these kids don't watch sports, so they have adopted AEW as like their sports team, right? And so I got that a lot when I was the Impact guy.
Yeah.
And I never treated Impact like the Impact was my team. I defended Impact because I had a deeper knowledge of it because I was watching it so in depth, but I never really saw Impact as my sports team. So when someone said they don't like it and they don't watch it, I'm like, cool, that's no problem. So and WWE fans are the same. They treat WWE as their sports team to where when somebody from WWE jumps ship to AEW, they're a traitor, right? And then
Yeah.
and vice versa. So they just naturally assume that you must hate their team because you're criticizing it, or you have a bias. You must be a WWE guy because you said this about AEW. But guess what, guys? I can like and dislike something on the same show. It's not that crazy, right?
Explain the cable radio network for people who have absolutely no idea where you heard the Shadow Man show.
So, I we had in my area it was called Falcon Cable,
Mhm.
right? And that was like our local cable company. My dad had worked for them for a little bit. And you would flip through the channels. You didn't really have a TV guide channel at this point. We had to actually have a TV guide, or you pull out the newspaper to see what was on at what time. You would flip through the channels, and the cable radio network was just a channel that played music in the or talk radio or music or whatever in the background. And then on it was like billboard advertisements. So they would just sift in. You would pay, like companies would pay to have their little billboard on that screen for like 5 seconds at a time, and it would just roll through these ads. And then in the background was the cable radio network, and like it was like early, like it was just talk radio, but it was on the television. This was before like satellite even.
Yeah.
And I was flipping through the channels on a Friday night one time, looking for something to watch, and I scrolled through and I heard someone talking about the Public Enemy. And I was just like, "What is this? Who is talking about Public Enemy? Not the rap group,
Not the rap group,
because
not Chuck
that,
D.
that would yeah, it wasn't Chuck D and Flava Flav, yeah boy, but it was Public Enemy, Johnny Grunge and Flyboy Rocco Rock, right? So they're talking about Public Enemy, and then I heard Raven. I was like, oh my god, they're talking about WCW. So I listened to him, and this guy was just so entertaining, and he had like a whole character and a whole gimmick. He was the Shadow Man. That's how we ended every show. And I just really got really interested into listening to him, and I thought he was fantastic.
I have the exact same experience, but a different human being behind the mic. His name was Dynamite D. He used to be the show was called Wrestle Talk. He used to be,
Mhm.
out of the Slammers Wrestling Gym in SoCal somewhere. I still don't know too much about Slammers Wrestling Gym, but John the Rock and I have the same exact experience of sitting in front of the TV, our parents going like, "There's n what are you wa there's nothing on, like, why are you watching this channel?" And so, because you are a few years later, what we had in San Jose, it was a blue screen with white rolling text. Those were the
That's so
ads.
funny.
And so we would listen to Dynamite D, and then, so we go on vacation, and I would pre-record the VCR on I had to make sure that it was on this cable channel so that I could get the 2 episodes of Dynamite D that I would miss when we were, on vacation. And you know what I would do? And people don't do this anymore, they have video games now, but I would bust out my, Status Pro Baseball, which was like a baseball board game with, cards, and you would flip and get statistics and basically play a game. And I would just play that while this thing is on in the background. Now, I don't know what how you thought the Shadow Man got his news, but after the fact, and when I've sort of put things together, what I'm going to guess is that Dynamite D was an Observer subscriber.
Yes.
That's what
Yeah.
I'm gonna guess as far as how he
Yeah.
got his news.
Yeah.
because he was on top of this is the Ric Flair going from WCW to WWF. He had that so early, and so I felt so close to that story because of Dynamite D. But what I now imagine, and I've gone back to read these issues of the Observer, he had to be reading the Observer.
Yeah, well, I guarantee. Well, I know for a fact the Shadow Man read the Observer because he would reference the Observer
Yeah.
on his show. But he would bring on this guy named Dr. Mike Leno, and
Oh
Doctor
my
Doctor
goodness.
Mike, yeah, Doctor Mike would come on, and he would. It was the Leno report or something like that, and he would be, breaking his news. But if you go back and look at it, he was just regurgitating what he had read from the Observer as
Yeah.
well. But no, Shadow Man definitely got it from the Observer because he referenced it all the time. So that was the first I'd ever heard of Dave, but he didn't really have like a website, and Shadow Man didn't really talk about how to subscribe to the
Yeah.
newsletter. He would just say Dave Meltzer reported this, and I knew the name, but I didn't know like anything about like the newsletter or anything like that. I probably read I didn't read my first Wrestling Observer newsletter till like I heard Brian Alvarez when I was in Korea. And I knew of Dave up until that point. And I just remember when Chris Benoit died, I saw him on TV all the time, but I never actually read any of the newsletters until a little bit later.
Yeah, I would have read Dave first in the National in like 1991, and then I didn't subscribe until I want to say 99 or 2000 or something like that.
Yeah.
But back in the late 90s, the internet was literally just copying everybody's stuff and like pasting it on some random Angel Fire website. So
Yeah.
I was able to read all the Bret Hart stuff from the Observer just through these random websites that you could find out there. So
Yeah.
internet's
And I
changed a
got
little bit.
all that news about Bret Hart. I got it from the Shadow Man. He talked about it in depth, and I'm pretty sure he was just reading the Observer.
It's awesome. That's awesome. I'm gonna go look. I couldn't find him. I did a quick search. I don't see any Dynamite D shows on YouTube, but the problem is you type in Dynamite and anything related to wrestling, you just get
Yeah.
AEW stuff. So I may have to sift through like thousands of pages on YouTube to find it. Okay. Last question comes from your podcast partner here, JD Oliva. He says, with hindsight in mind, what would your strategy be against Akebono this time?
So do you know the story that he's talking about?
I think you've told me,
Okay.
but I don't remember.
No, I don't think I've ever talked to you about this. So we talked about it on Brace for Impact. So I want to say it was 2006. I was a heavy partier at the time, and we were having a kegger there on the Yokota Air Base. And Akebono's wife worked on base, and he lived in the area, and he would come onto base and he would hang out with a lot of the island kids. So the Filipinos, the Chamorros, and the Hawaiian kids and all the Samoan kids that we had on base, like they would all gravitate towards Akebono. He was kind of like a hero to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he was a big hero in Japan. I'd seen him around base and stuff, and I knew who he was because he was on WrestleMania.
Yeah.
And I saw on watch local Japanese TV. I actually saw his match against Brock Lesnar. I watched it on local TV there. So anyway, we're having a keg party, and I was just totally faced, right? And I walk outside, and I see a lot of the island kids from the gym. I worked out with some of these guys, and then one of the guys was I was doing some MMA training at the time, and he actually would train with us sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was starting to walk over there, but I was so hammered. I started to walk over there to invite them to the kegger, right?
Yeah.
Well, my buddy was like, dude, they don't want to see you. And I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, bro, don't even go. I was like, oh, come on. Everybody loves me, right? Like, so I thought. So I went over there, and I was like, hey, guys, come on over. And then one of the kids, like, pie faces me, just puts his hand in my face. And then I saw red, right, immediately. And I start to go after him. And then he runs behind all those guys. So I go into a wall of island kids, right? And island kids will whoop your ass. Don't even try to mess with these guys, right? So I go, and I'm trying to get them, and they're like pushing me, like, get back. And I'm like saying every mean thing that you could say to somebody. I'm telling all of them, right? Because I'm willing to fight everybody. And I'm trying to get to this guy. And so Akebono steps up, and he's like trying to shove me back. He's like, go away. And I criticize his weight, probably not so eloquently. And I got right into his chest, and I looked up at him, and I was like, what the fuck you gonna, or sorry, what are you gonna do? and he's like, just get away. And then he shoves me back, right? And well, my ex-wife and my buddies were behind me right when he does that because they're trying to pull me back, but I'm not having it. And like my wife at the time, she falls back, she hits her head on the concrete.
Oh, jeez.
So she's like passed out, and like a buddy of mine picked her up and carried her into the thing, and I didn't even notice because I wasn't a good husband at the time, so that's my ex-wife. But as I'm still trying to fight, now I'm trying to fight Akebono because he put his hands on me, and people are trying to hold me back, and they're trying to hold him back, and I'm like, I was willing to fight the guy. Well, anyway, finally the whole thing calms down, and the cops show up. And they're talking to me. They arrest him because somebody said that he assaulted my wife, which did not happen. He shoved me, right? And the force of his shove knocked my wife over.
Right.
Thankfully, there's so many people behind me that I didn't hit the ground. I probably would have, but there's people behind me. I just fell into them and I stayed up.
Yeah.
And so they end up arresting him, but he's too big to go into the cop car. And so he has to get, I think he had like an Escalade or something like that. So his wife ends up driving him to the police station. Well, my ex-wife and I would go to the hospital. I think I blew a .24.
Wow.
Is what I blew. Like I don't know why they gave me a breathalyzer because I wasn't driving, but they just wanted to see how drunk I was.
Yeah.
And like my friend who was a cop, she was Tongan. And she goes, Mike, do you know who that was? And I was just like, no, and I'm just so drunk. And I'm just like, no, who is that? And she goes, it's Akebono. I go, it's freaking Akebono. She goes, you just tried to fight Akebono. What the hell is wrong with you? And I'm just like, well, he got in my face. He shoved me. What was I supposed to do? Right.
Wow.
And so me and her start talking. And then like some of the other cops come in and they go, like, and then other people are just coming into the hospital room there just to see me because I was the guy that tried to fight Akebono. Right. And so the next day, the police show up at my house and they were given a statement. And I'm just like, look, and this is how I am to this day. I was just like, look, is he still there? Like, no, we let him go. I was like, don't press charges on that guy. It was just two drunk guys having an argument. As far as I'm concerned, it's squashed. And they go, so you don't want anything to happen? I was like, no, don't let anything to happen. I want him to lose his base access. It's like, I'll see him down the road and then we'll squash things. No problem. Well, Monday rolls around. I see one of the guys in the gym. I was like, what happened, dude? I was like, I thought we were all cool. And he's like, yeah, we were all cool, but we don't really like it when white dudes approach us when we're in our group. And I was just like, that's a little racist, guys. I was like, I thought we were friends. And well, yeah, we still are friends, but maybe when you're drunk, don't try to approach a bunch of island kids. So I was like, well, I trust me, I ain't gonna approach you guys anymore after what happened. But I was like, look, tell Akebono that me and him are cool. He ain't gonna get no problems out of me. I'm not gonna try to fight him. Like he was worried, but and he goes, that's cool. I was like, and I told him what I told the cops, and he goes, oh, that's cool. That's really cool, you man. I was like, yeah, no problem. Well, fast forward like 3 months later, I'm at the swimming pool on the base, and there's Akebono and all the island kids and his wife, and I'm there alone. I ain't got no backup, and I'm like, well, this could go really bad. I just walk right by him. He looks at me. I look at him. I nod. He nods back. And we squashed it at that moment by 2 nods. And that was it. No problem. And we never had another issue again. I'd see him around every once in a while and never had another issue.
I wish I knew somebody who knew him so we could hear his recollection of this story. That would be fascinating.
He might not even really remember it.
I mean, the guy had to get it
drunk too.
Yeah, but he had to, he thought he was probably going to have to deal with some sort of charges or something.
Yeah. He might have, but with me, if it's just 2 drunk guys getting into an argument and shoving happens, no big deal, right? No, let dudes fight. It's no problem.
Yeah, no, it's good. That's one of the best stories I've heard. So shout out. I know it's probably something you've had to like come to, conclusion about. Like, okay, I can think of this story in a very funny way, but that kind of story can also hang on you in a different way to where you get really bothered by that story being, in your past.
Yeah, well, that one's more of a funny one. I always felt bad that my ex-wife, hit her head on the ground. Like that sucks, and then I did have to go in front of my commander and my first sergeant. It didn't really, because it hit the what we call the blotter. It's like all the police reports that get filed. If you're attached to any type of unit, it goes to the commander. So before he had a chance to read it, I went to him to tell him the story that had happened. And because I told the story in a funny way, like I never got in any kind of trouble for it. I never really had what they would call an alcohol related incident, which that very much would meet the definition of it.
Yeah.
Like I'm in the position now where like I've given people some like discipline for less, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I never got any of that. I never had any recourse, but that's one of probably 10,000 reasons why I don't drink anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because today, like sober Mike, I ain't trying to fight that guy.
No. No
like
way.
what's that? I won't back down from anybody, but I'm never going to be in that position to begin with. I would be
Right.
smarter than that,
Right.
All
right. My 3 questions for you. We'll make them short here.
Okay.
Your first memory of pro wrestling, like what is the first thing that you remember in your origin story of pro wrestling?
I was born in 1983. My earliest memory was Hulk Hogan slamming Andre the Giant in 1987.
Oh wow! So you're little.
So 4 years old. Yeah, I remember it because we were all at my grandma's house, all watching it because wrestling was just hugely popular at the time. And my dad had the hookups, was able to get us that pay-per-view. He probably would tell me that he paid for it, but he probably did. But the whole family was together and we watched Andre get slammed, and that was my earliest memory. And I have a t-shirt of that match because it's my earliest memory. It's just kind of like a fond memory of me with my cousins and all my uncles, and we're all at my grandma's house, and most of those people are not with us anymore. So that's one of my favorite childhood memories.
So you went from watching Hogan slam Andre at 4 years old to later that night watching Eddie Murphy say "Goonie Goo Goo" on Delirious.
Yeah.
Okay. Favorite match of all time?
It would be Austin and Bret Hart from WrestleMania 13. I don't think anything will ever touch it. I think anything that ever comes out after that gets a higher star rating, I think that rating needs to go up for that match, right? Like, the Favored Nations from Hall and Nash, I think that match deserves it.
Yeah.
It's one of the most pivotal matches in wrestling history. There are some hipsters out there that will tell you that the Survivor Series 96 match between Bret and Austin is better. They are wrong. That match was a great match, don't get me wrong, but Bret Austin WrestleMania 13 had so much emotion in it, so it was such a charged up match. The Chicago crowd was just insane for that match, and then Steve Austin becomes the biggest babyface of all time in that match, and Bret Hart becomes one of the greatest heels of all time in that match. They did it at the same time. I just can't think of a better story that I've ever seen in a match outside of that. Look, I love Omega and Okada, love it. Love Omega and Will Ospreay.
Well, I mean, the question is favorite. It doesn't have to, what's the one that leaves the mark on you?
I've never seen anything elicit emotion the way that I saw that match, right? Because, it was just such a supercharged match and so heated, just incredible stuff.
The worst thing about that match is that it happened in 1997 for WWE when WrestleMania meant the least it's ever meant in the word of that show, because they did a lower buy rate for that WrestleMania than whatever the random WCW pay-per-view was at that time. And just imagine if that match happens later in 97 or even early in 98, it would be so much bigger than it is. And I still feel like it's a big match. It was just watched live during a time when WWE's popularity was maybe, one of the 2 or 3 lowest times ever. So, there's some interesting timing in that. Cause like you said, it kind of creates something from the match, but
and it was one of those, it was a happy accident because that match wasn't supposed to happen.
Yeah.
Because that feud was over.
Austin and the British Bulldog is supposed to be that match for that show.
And Bret and Shawn. Right? Shawn gets hurt.
Doesn't want to do the job.
Doesn't want to do the job. And they just like, well, who's going to tear it down? It's going to be, Stone Cold and Bret. And of course they did. The feud was over and they just reignited it for that moment. And then it starts the
submission match too. And Austin's like, what the hell? I don't even have a submission move.
And he had all he had was the $1 million dream. That's the only thing. But he was like, I'm just gonna beat this guy until he gives up. That was his strategy. Bad strategy, but it was it made for a dramatic match. And the reason why they had to make it a submission match is because they had already had several other matches. They toured around. Like we were supposed to forget that they had even hated each other. They just happened to reignite it just for this moment, and it worked. And you know what? Like, yeah, the pay-per-view didn't draw because the pay-per-view was not good. Like the main event was Undertaker and Sid, and they just like tried to heat up Sid again for the millionth time.
Yep.
I think they tried. I think they had Ahmed Johnson and the Road Warriors or Legion of Doom like on the undercard. It was, you know what I mean? It was like the card was just so bad. They had the Rocky Maivia versus the Sultan, right? So it was just
with the Iron Sheik in his corner.
Yeah, it was so bad. But I would venture to say that yeah, maybe that pay-per-view didn't do good, but it led to so much big business, right?
Totally.
Like that picture of Austin bleeding while he's in the sharpshooter led to so many t-shirt sales, and the Stone Cold DVD that came, or the VHS that came out later that year, like it led to so many big moments that it translated into bigger business later. So I know the whole Al Snow thing, well, the greatest match must draw the must be the greatest draw. Not entirely true, because that match didn't draw at the time, but it led to drawing later. It's fascinating.
And the introduction of Ken Shamrock into WWE as well.
Yes, sir. Yep.
All right, last one, and then we'll get you out of here. We just talked about a television show that John Muse wants me to watch and that he got you to watch. Give me something else you'd recommend, entertainment-wise, could be anything, that is non-wrestling.
Oh man, the older I get, I watch like old people TV shows now. But one of my favorite TV shows to watch, and I think that it might be a tough watch back now, would be The Shield. I just thought that show was just so well done. So I love that. But I've been getting into not conspiracy theories, but just kind of like these different types of history shows and documentary shows. And if you're in the Fight Game Media Discord, we have a conspiracy corner. And Dr. Preet has been posting a YouTube show called The Y Files. And I was like, I didn't really give it a chance at first because it's like this conspiracy theorist, and he's got like a fish bowl behind him, and it's got a talking fish behind him. I was like, this is ridiculous. But I started to watch some of the stuff, and the guy does a great job of pulling out historical articles about the topic that he's covering. So he's done Roswell, he's done like CIA, he's done FBI. Recently, he did a whole episode that came out this week on AI that I just found fascinating, and the dangers of ChatGPT using periodicals and using like real world, like New York Times, New York Post, like Wall Street Journal articles, and then just kind of breaking them down for everybody and trying to give both sides of the story. The guy does a great job, and he does it in an entertaining way. And then all of a sudden the fish will come out and say something nonsensical to kind of bust things up. He did a great job on that. I really was fascinated by the America, the Land of Giants story that he did, like a deep dive into archaeology and about how there's certain parts of America that might have had people like over 8 feet tall that roamed in that area. And they actually, archaeologists have actually dug up the bones and things like that. And he's showing it there, and talking about like the theories behind it and stuff like that. The Roswell one was super interesting. We did the whole the alien segment on our show, where he did a deep dive on it, and he really debunked a lot of the nonsense that surrounds that story, while still kind of leaving it open for the possibilities of different things that could have occurred in that Roswell incident. So I've been really enjoying the Y File. So I'd recommend, if you guys are, into, going against like accepted narratives of what's going on in the world today, or even in the past, if you want to take a look at what other people are saying, because like the media kind of gravitates towards like typically one type of narrative, right? Depending on the news station. But this guy kind of dives into all of it and takes a look at these alternative theories that I think are okay to discuss too. I don't think that it's a dangerous thing to have a differing opinion than what the mainstream would give you. And I find stuff like that fascinating. Without putting on a tinfoil hat, you take an educated opinion about certain things that have happened throughout history. I think it's cool.
Well, you can find Mike on the Mike and JD show, which I would say is consistently our top downloaded show on the network these days. So kudos to you guys. and Twitter and all that. Where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Mike Gilbert 311. I do not have a Threads account, and I'm not likely to get one until Threads becomes better than Twitter. And as of right now, apparently it's not better. So, because I'm also not restarting my Instagram account, I deleted that years ago. So, I'm not over there. But yeah,
Doesn't have
find me
the
on Twitter.
eyeballs yet.
No, find me on Twitter at Mike Gilbert 311. 311, yes, the band 311. I have a 311 tattoo. I like that band. This is my second concert, 311. Love those guys.
There you go.
And also, yeah, go to the Fight Game Media YouTube and like and subscribe and comment on the videos. Help us defeat that algorithm. I don't know what's going on these last couple weeks. My numbers are not where I'd like them to be. So let's get those numbers up. We got rookie numbers on there. Unless you're Scott E. Wrestling, that guy is killing it.
Yeah, Scott's doing a great job.
Yeah, he is. So let's get those numbers up. I'd really appreciate that.
All right. So I hope that you got to learn a little bit about Mike Gilbert, the man behind the Mike and JD show. So thanks to Mike for hanging out. Man, we went over 90 minutes. So hopefully it's not too long for people. I hope they enjoyed it. But for Mike, I'm Double G. Thanks to you for listening. Peace out.